Hey, what's up, pop-up campers? Welcome back to It's Poppin', where we talk about, well, these things, pop-up campers. So, as the title suggests, I want to talk about your pop-up camper electrical system. Essentially, everything you need to know about your pop-up camper's electrical system. And it's really not too complex once you break it down. So, the heart and soul of your pop-up camper's electrical system is called a converter. Now, that's not to be confused or used interchangeably with an inverter. Now, they're essentially two different things. So a converter converts 120 volt down to 12 volt. And I apologize to anybody, outside the US or Canada who's might be operating on different voltages and different systems, but nevertheless, we are kind of a US centric channel. But I digress. So a converter converts electricity from 120 down to 12 volt, whereas an inverter does the exact opposite, 12 volt to essentially 120 volt. But like I said, the converter is the heart and soul of your electrical system. I would say the majority of us probably go to campgrounds that have electricity available. There's probably, some sort of post and commonly a 30 amp or a 50 amp connector. And I'd say most pop-ups connect into a 30 amp. So you'll take out, of course, the cord out of your pop-up, plug it into that shore power, and then of course you have 120 volt running into your pop-up camper, and life's great. Everything that your pop-up camper came with, all the amenities and features all work, which is great. Now, on the flip side, let's say you're boondocking, dry camping, and only have a battery or battery bank, which of course is a 12 volt system, probably on the tongue of your pop-up camper. There are a few things in your pop-up camper that won't work if you're just on 12 volt. So to name a few, first and foremost, the outlets will not work just on battery power. Those do require 120 volts. So if you're plugging in a phone charger into a wall outlet or trying to run a coffee maker or a griddle, those aren't going to work, unfortunately. Now, if you have a rooftop air conditioner, nope, that's not going to work either, unfortunately, as well. It just draws too much power. And in some of the high walls, kind of like ours, you might have a microwave. Once again, too high of wattage. It just can't work on a 12 volt system. So what will work if you're not plugged into shore power? And there's quite a big long list, and well, that's because a lot of people don't always want to be plugged in and might want to get away from the campgrounds and such. So if you do have a battery system, or even one battery for that matter, it might not get you too far, but here are the things that will work if you're not plugged into shore power. First and foremost, your interior lights. Those will definitely work. A lot of people, of course, will have like a little propane detector that's 12 volt. Your propane heater fan, importantly, that's 12 volts. So of course, if you're boondocking and you have propane and battery, you can run your propane heater, which is really important. A lot of people might have a water pump. So if, once again, you're boondocking, have water in your water holding tank, you can of course switch on that 12 volt water pump and you'll have water pressure. We just installed a 12 volt roof vent fan, which is great for removing moisture from inside the pop-up camper. Once again, 12 volts. Now, getting into a few things that you may or may not have that work on 12 volt, our cassette toilet does, and fortunately we have a 12 volt electric flush, but you might have just one of the manual pumps if you have a toilet in your pop-up camper. Radios and of course the speakers that are connected to those will work on your 12 volt system. Now, getting into some of the nicer, newer, fancier pop-ups, if you have an electric tongue jack and or an electric roof lifting system, those will work on 12 volts, and you definitely need a 12 volt battery on the front of your pop-up camper in order to utilize those. And finally, just a few more for the sake of completeness. If it came with one, or possibly if you modified your pop-up, you might have some sort of 12 volt outlet like USB plugs or a 12 volt socket for running some of those smaller things or charging phones or devices. Once again, 12 volt. And then finally, and we haven't run across these in any of the pop-up campers that we've owned, but I think some of the water heaters out there might have like an electric ignition. Once again, 12 volts. So a decent list of like 10 or 11 items that will work just on 12 volts that you don't need to be plugged into shore power in order to utilize. Now, there is that one thing out there that actually runs on both, and not only both 12 volt and 120 volt, but also propane. And that is, of course, your three-way refrigerator. Now, if you're plugged into shore power, switch that on 120, works no problem. If you're out there boondocking, highly recommend using propane. That's actually a pretty efficient means of cooling down your pop-up camper. Now, your refrigerator also runs on 12 volt. And this kind of brings me into my next system regarding your pop-up camper and electricity. And that is when you plug your pop-up camper into your tow vehicle via your wiring harness. So let's say you have a 7-pin wiring harness for your pop-up camper that plugs into that 7-pin connector in your tow vehicle. That will enable, when you're traveling down the road, for your tow vehicle to charge your onboard battery. And that onboard battery in turn will be able to keep your pop-up camper refrigerator cool utilizing 12 volt. So that's kind of a nice thing, but that's the only scenario that I would recommend utilizing 12 volts to keep your refrigerator cool. And from what I've heard anecdotally, it's really not even to cool down your refrigerator, it's just to maintain temperature. So let's say you pre-cool your refrigerator prior to going out, it's really just to maintain that temperature that you've pre-cooled that refrigerator to. Now, in addition to the refrigerator, when you're connected up to your tow vehicle, of course, will also provide the, I guess, electricity needed to power all of your kind of auxiliary lights on the exterior of your pop-up camper. So you have your brake lights, the lights on the back, of course, and the sides, while your tow vehicle lights are on, just so, of course, people can see your pop-up camper as you're traveling down the road. So really, there's almost 3 things to think about in terms of how your pop-up camper gets power. 120 volt, 12 volt from a battery, and then, of course, 12 volt coming from your tow vehicle. Now, there are a few caveats or things that you can do, of course, to get power to your pop-up camper if you don't have shore power, or to supplement your onboard battery system. And the first one is rather simple, and so I'll talk about that first. And that is a generator. Now, if you have a generator, and just a small aside, I would say most people who camp who also have air conditioners recommend a minimum of about a 3,500 watt generator. If you don't have an air conditioner or aren't concerned about that much power, of course you can step it down a little bit. And each generator in and of themselves have different receptacles that you can plug into. So of course, if you have a 30 amp plug for your pop-up, it would be nice to have a 30 amp receptacle right in your generator. That way you can, of course, fire up your generator, plug in your 30 amp plug, and it's just like you would be plugged into shore power, with the exception, of course, that you're burning gasoline and it's a little louder. So that will enable you to, of course, utilize all of your 120 volt systems and your 12 volt systems, like I said, just like you're plugged into shore power. Now, what about solar power? That's absolutely an option as well. However, it's a little bit more complicated. With solar power, of course, you're going to need some solar panels, which are then going to connect to some sort of charge controller, which will then connect into your battery system. And when the sun's out, you'll of course be drawing energy into your 12 volt batteries, and then that will enable you to, of course, utilize that entire list of 11 or 12 items that I listed off previously within your pop-up that run on 12 volt. Now, what if you want to run some of your 120 volt systems while you're on solar, or if you have a big enough battery bank? That will require the addition of that inverter that I talked about. So you'll of course be taking 12 volt and inverting it to 120 volt. So of course you can plug in some of probably your lower powered appliances, charge cell phones, devices, things of that nature. One common, I don't know, misconception I see is that you can't utilize your pop-up camper's systems without a battery on the front. At least as far as I know, and most modern converters do not require you to have a 12 volt battery up front. However, if there's no 12 volt battery, that 100% means that you need to be plugged into shore power for all of those systems previously mentioned to work. So you don't have to have a battery, but if you're not in shore power, then you do if you want to use those dozen or so appliances and features. So that's your pop-up camper electrical system in a nutshell. I hope this helped clear up some confusion, or at least add a little bit to your working knowledge of your pop-up camper and its electrical systems. So as always, guys, hopefully we see you in the next video. If not, hopefully we see you out there camping.